Specialization is, or in the past couple of years, I have worked on a translation process research, and I would like to talk about our resources and what translation process research is. So first I will give an introduction, a small historical introduction about translation process research. So it is basically the question to uncover what happens in the black box of a translator. So as translators translate, they read text, obviously source text, and they type in the translations successively. And how does this work? What kind of processes go on in the head of a translator? And what are the problems, and what are the challenges, and so on. So this is translation process research. So they had this idea to investigate what happens in the black box of a translator. This question popped up more intensively around the mid-80s. There were various techniques. People started using think aloud protocols. Means translators were reporting while they were typing in translations. They were reporting what they think. This was documented, transcribed, and evaluated. And then slowly more better observation techniques have developed. Keyboard logging and eye trackers. Then also we have this fMRI, so this brain imaging technologies, I think that we were discussing yesterday, partially at least. So different technologies have been used, techniques for investigating what happens in the head of a translator. I will very briefly talk about this, and then we have developed, what we are using is key logging and eye tracking technology. Means what a translator types in time and where a translator looks on the screen. So this is micro-behavioral data. Micro-behavioral, so production of keystrokes is behavior, gaze data is behavior. So we are looking into micro-behavioral data. I will talk mostly about this, or this is what the database is about. This is the technique that I have been using in the past 10 years or so. And we have developed a number of visualization techniques to do this, and a couple of measurements. How do we measure these processes and so on? I will talk about this a little bit. And then I will show an interface to our database. So first, I will talk about I give some overview about the techniques that we have been using, and then I will look into this database. So this will be maybe the first 3 points will be perhaps 30-40 minutes, and then we can talk about this grid database. And so whenever there's a question, I would ask you to please interfere immediately and ask a question, so we have plenty of time where we can go into some details and look into some questions. Okay, so translation process research is the question: by what observable and presumed mental processes do translators arrive at their translations? And this is a citation from Jacobsen in 2017. So just hold on one second. Sorry for this. Telephone was ringing and nobody there to switch it off. Okay, so translation process research, as I said, started in the in the mid-80s, and the question was, by what observable and presumed mental processes do translators arrive at their translations? So the question, what happens in the black box? And the questions that are related to this branch of research is investigate translation difficulties. What makes translations difficult? So there are some possibilities or hints are terms. Translators may not know what a term means or how a term is to be translated. Typical or collocations, what do special collocations mean? How do typical or idiomatic collocations translate into another language? Then we have something called unique items, words, culturally specific words, for instance, that exist in one culture but not so much in another one. So this might be translation difficulties, strategies. Translators have developed strategies. So for instance, they prepare for a translation session. They use search online. Why? When they don't know something, they will look into different kinds of tools. Specialized tools exist there for translators. And then the question is, of course, how expertise impacts this. So what is the impact of expertise on different strategies and also difficulties? So we have bilinguals, so people who know two languages. Most Indians know, for instance, three languages or even more perhaps. So the Indians are typically all bilingual or multilingual, but this is still something different from translators. Okay, so one can be bilingual. It's a necessary condition for being a translator, but translators know more than bilingual. So we have then novice translators, student translators, for instance. They develop some or have been taught some strategies, how to translate, how to go about difficulties and so on. We have professionals and expert translators. So these are all maybe different groups. And one can look then into how do those people, what is expertise and what consists translation expertise, and how do more experienced translators go about different strategies? How do difficulties show up for them and so on? So the way translation process research has been conducted so far is by looking into the variation of the product and the process. Means what is the variation amongst, for instance, bilingual novices and so on, as compared to more experienced translators. And to get an access to those kinds of variation, we collect alternative translations. So means, for instance, we have one text, and this one text is translated by different novice translators, so 10 or 20 novice translators, or 10 or 20 expert translators, and then we can see some variation in the translation output and in the translation process. And then we can see whether the variation is different for the novice translators or experienced translators, whether they are different for specific types of texts and so on. But I will go into detail explaining all this into more detail and how these ideas have been developed over the years. So, as I said in the beginning, in mid-80s, people came up with Think Aloud protocol. And this is, as I already alluded to, so translators would sit, produce their translation in the mid-80s, mostly still with pencil and paper, but then also the PC came up, and a little bit later, translators were using computers to type in translation, to produce translations. And so the translations and the texts were available in digital form. But while producing, so the think aloud idea is that while they were producing the translations, they would comment, they would think aloud what they were doing, right? So they would say, for instance, I'm now looking here, I'm stuck with this translation, and what could it mean? And so they would introspect themselves and speak out what happened in their mind. And these would be recorded. And at the same time, also, one could videotape translators while working on either on paper or on screen. And these records would be transcribed manually. And then researchers would evaluate these tapes and relate what they were saying, try to find patterns in the reported problems, and try to see regularities with respect to stretches of words. So how would they report these difficulties and so on. So this was a think aloud protocol, as you can see, extremely intensive, time intensive and labor intensive kind of research. And this has been the main method of research until the mid-90s. Then something came up that was then called empirical translation process research. We had a translog, which is basically an editor in which translators would type their translation, and they had a keylogging device. So every keystroke would be associated with a timestamp, so that one could replay and see exactly how translations evolve in time. And then in 2005, there was an I2IT project, or eye trackers became available around 2000 or so, and some companies produced eye trackers that were suited to connect to those keylogging programs. And so with these eye tracking, it would become, one could record what translators read in the source or in the target text. And with keylogging, one could see what translators type. And so there is an eye-hand relation, right? So there is a gap between the reading a word, for instance, a source text expression, and typing in the translation of it. So this is the eye key span, the lag of time between reading something and typing out the translation of it. And this eye key span, for instance, could be an indicator to see how difficult something a translation is to be produced. So one would assume that if the time span is long, then the word would be more difficult, or the expression would be more difficult to produce than if the span is very short. So immediately a word comes up in the translator's mind, and they would immediately type out the translation and so on. So the main difference here between think aloud protocols, or one of the differences is, and this empirical translation process research with translog, with keylogger and eye tracker, is that we have with keylogging some a time gap in the order of 100 milliseconds, whereas on a narrative scale, when translators speak about their translation problems, we would maybe have gaps of 3 seconds until a translator becomes aware of the translation problem and speaks it out. So we have a narrative scale here, 3 seconds, 3 seconds, whereas with keylogging we have 100 milliseconds, or maybe immediately, and with eye tracking data we have around 100 milliseconds precision in the data, which of course also allows completely different kinds of questions and requires very different methods for analysis as compared to analysis on the narrative scale. Then, so this process, this empirical translation process research with translog and with keylogging and eye tracking started around 95, maybe. In 2005, eye tracking technology became available, and then I joined a project I2IT in Copenhagen Business School, where we use this eye tracking technology, and a large number of studies were collected. So different researchers conducted research and stored these data on their local drives or somewhere locally. And then the idea came up that we should integrate all these data in a kind of a consistent format. And we built a database that would assemble all these different data in a consistent format. And so this has been going on over the past 15 years or so. Now we have large database with 5,000 or so different sessions from different translators into various languages and so on. And they are all on a server, which in one database, and on the server, in one database, which we call the Translation Process Research Database. And I will talk a little bit later about an interface which we can access then with Jupyter and Python and R interface. And we can enrich these data with further alternative translations, annotated and so on. I will show this interface a little bit later. So before going into those details, there are two kinds of variables or main aspects in this translation process that are that are most important. So we have on the one hand, we have translation effort. So how difficult it is for a translator to produce a translation. What are the difficulties and the problems? Some authors make a distinction between difficulties and problems. So difficulties for those authors relate to the intrinsic problems or difficulties in text. So some texts are more complex. For instance, they are more embedded, they have more difficult structures, they have more less frequent words and so on. So these would be kinds of intrinsic difficulties. Problems then would relate to problems that a translator has, which is not necessary. Maybe it's often related to the difficulties, to the textual difficulties, but not necessarily so. An expert maybe, for instance, very well know terminology in a certain domain, and even though the text is difficult, it is not a problem for the translator, right? So these problems maybe for some authors relates to the problems of a translator, whereas difficulties are in the text and so on. Then we have three, or often this distinction is made between three types of efforts: technical, temporal, and cognitive effort. Technical effort is the effort exerted by a translator to produce the text. So means basically keystrokes, mouse movements, deletions, insertions, so technical stuff using the fingers basically. Then we have temporal, so how long does it take? So one just needs to look at the watch. So this is easy to assess. Temporal and technical and temporal effort is easy to assess just by measuring the number of keystrokes, by measuring the time. Cognitive effort relates to how difficult this translation is for a translator, how many cognitive resources are used. And this is something which is, of course, hidden in the translator's mind somehow, or in the translator's structure, cognitive structure perhaps, and often it is related to pauses, how many pauses translators do when producing a text, or how the eyes move. So if we see much going back and forth between different parts of a text, so that is an indicator maybe of cognitive effort and so on. So with cognitive effort, we can only measure indirectly, whereas technical and temporal effort, we have direct measurements. So effort is one thing that is an important variable, and we want to decrease. I mean, translators are interested in spending as less effort as necessary. On the other hand, we have translation effects. And effect would then mainly relate to the translation quality. So, and translation quality can be measured in terms of accuracy and fluency. Accuracy means how precise, how good is the translation, or how well are words, terms translated from the source into the target text, how accurate is the translation. Fluency relates to the ease of reading. So is it syntactically correct in the target language? Is it idiomatic, and so on? Then we have another dimension, which is the translation brief, and which is also an important background information for translators. Translators often do not just start translating just with no indicator, but they are often told what is the intended audience, for whom they are translating, and where is something to be published. So the translation will be very different if a text is supposed to be an in-house communication, for instance, or whether it's for a company and they want to present themselves in a new market, where the texts need to be polished and every word needs to be very well reflected. So we may have translations that require very high quality, or translations that roughly give you an idea, and where it's not so important. Every formulation is not so important. So this translation brief is something that translators often get from companies, from their clients. The clients will tell them, so this translation is for this and this purpose. And then, of course, the quality, translation quality, cannot be assessed independent from the translation brief. So it needs to go hand in hand with the purpose of the translation. An accuracy or fluency for a highly expected text, highly polished text, is, of course, something different for just a in-house communication or something like this. Okay, so we have these two parameters, effort and effect, so where that play a big role. And then what translation process research tries to establish are translation models. So what is the relation between those two variables, effort and effect, and how does expertise play a role in this? So, and what is competence? What is translation competence? What are skills? What are translation skills? What kind of knowledge is required for a translator to do his job? And which of all this will decrease the effort and increase the effect, right? So increase the relevance of the translation. Strategies, automatism. So there is often a talk, many authors agree that there are automatisms. So translator does produce some parts of the translation automatically. So there are some kinds of automatisms, but there's also conscious processing involved. So reflection and revising and reflective thought and so on. So how does automatism and how does conscious process play a role in all this? And how does it relate to expertise, competence, skills, and all these terms? So this is basically roughly the questions in translation process research. And then as I said, there are different techniques how to investigate this. the earlier technique from the mid-80s was just think aloud. Translators would report their problems or their insights, their solutions, and so on. And researchers would try to figure out these kinds of models, try to figure out what strategies were used, what are automatism, when does conscious processing kick in, and all this. Then in 95, as I have already mentioned, there was Translog, development of Translog. It's a computer program. I will show a screen on one of the next slides. So this was a research kind of a program where translators would sit in front of a screen and see the source text, type in the translation, and the keystrokes would be recorded in time. And yes, so then in 2005, eye tracking technology was added to this so that we would see reading behavior, so how a translator understands the source segment, what reading activities are processed or done by translators, and what are the typing activities, what are the chunks of typing, and so on. So this kind of research was then possible with this Translog program. So here is a screenshot of Translog. We have here in the upper case is the source text. In this lower window here is a target box where a translator would type in the translation. And this is a Toby eye tracker. So this is an eye tracker, which has the screen here. And then down here, Toby TX, I think it was 120. So this is an old model that I think they don't produce it anymore. So this is an eye tracker from 10 years ago. But in principle, the newer versions, the newer eye trackers work in the same way. So you have down here, there are light bulbs for those who have not seen eye trackers until now. So we have light bulbs here in that emit infrared light. The light is reflected in the eyes. Then there are cameras in this lower part here too. And they would then record the reflections of the light in the eyes and calculate where on the screen the translator is looking. This data would be here then on the one hand, we have keylogging. Each keystroke would be recorded. On the other hand, we have gaze data, where that records where on this screen the translator looks. And this could be then visualized in these kinds of translation progression graphs. Here, this progression graph shows here on the left side a vertical axis, a source text that has 160 words. And on the horizontal axis is the time axis in milliseconds. So this whole session here takes 440,000 milliseconds. 440 seconds is 7.5 minutes. So this whole graph represents 7.5 minutes in which this 160 word text would be translated. The blue axis here represent fixations on the source text. So here, this translator first reads the source text, right? So going all these fixations, you can see it reads in the first, how much is it? 40 seconds or so, the source text. Then we call this this would be the orientation phase, and often translators first read. You can see in blue are fixations. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So here you can see the green axis, the green pluses are fixations on the target text, and the blue are fixations on the source text. Here, so then I zoom into to illustrate this. Okay. So here, so here is a translator who has 3 phases: an orientation phase, a drafting phase, and a revision phase, where he goes over this text again. Then here we have another translator who who reads a sentence, types in the translation of it, reads a sentence, types in the translation, reads a sentence, types in the translation, and so on. Okay, so this is a kind of a different strategy. This translator only reads a piece and then goes and types in this what he just read, and then sometimes reading ahead small pieces of text, maybe to remind him or to see what this is about, and so on. So this is we call this large context planner. Then we have here a small context planner. This person here basically also, like the one before, they don't have an orientation and a revision phase. They only read a few words here, one phrase, 5 or so words maybe, then type in a translation, and basically it's like a transducer, right? So reading, typing out without much reading ahead, and so on. So here I now go zoom into this part here to see more in detail what happens in this part. So here we have this segment on the left side: only the awareness of other hospital staff put a stop to him and to his killings. So this is the source text that the translator is going to translate or translating into Danish. We have on the right side here, this is the Danish translation of it. And you can see here, these are the alignments. So we have the Danish translation of only is this expression here. And then we have here, well, these are, so you can see stop on the left side here is stopper. And then this part here is almost word for word, no? Stopper for hem, and the death, no? And so on. So, and here we can see how these translations emerge in time. Here we have the typing of this phrase, "O kun I kraft," or something like this. This expression here is typed all very quickly here, while the translator reads already ahead what comes next, then monitors on the target side, means on that screen in the lower part that I showed previously, what happens here in red. Then there are deletions, so types in something, deletes what was just typed here. Then in Danish there is a kind of syntactic reordering. Yeah, so in Danish would be this is the translation of other hospital awareness, hospital staff awareness. So there is a kind of a reordering required for Danish, right? So that makes that there is some hesitation here, deletion, and so on. And then once this kind of a small translation problem is resolved, okay, here the translator goes ahead and then almost word for word types in a monotonous translation here quite fluently. Right? I hope this is clear to everyone. So this is the translation process of one translator. And then we can extract some kind of, instead of, so one question, of course, in translation process research is, so we have 2 streams. We have a stream of keystrokes and we have a stream of gaze data. And here we can see how it is synchronized. Okay, so we can see that here reading happens while typing. Here is monitoring, means looking on the target text while the keystrokes occur on the target text. This is lots of information. And one question is, how can we get a grip on this? How can we conceptualize this? And one idea would be to produce what we call production units. So the inside, and as you can see in this graph here too, the translation emerges in terms of typing bursts. So there is some typing happening, typing and reading. Okay, and these boxes here represent coherent kinds of typing. Okay, so we have here this coherent stretch of typing lasts 1.2 seconds, this one here 2.3 seconds, and so on. So we see that here some kind of coherent typing takes place, and between these typing stretches there are some spaces in time where no typing takes place, and we, like you can see here, that during this time the gaze wanders on the source or the target text, presumably here to find a good translation for the next piece of chunk. So we have a alternating or reading and typing, and we call this. There's much speculation about how large these units are. It's called translation units, and these are kind of minimum behavioral kinds of entities in which we can assume that this stretch of typing in one translation, in one burst, typing burst here, relates to the amount of information that could be stored in memory and be typed out as a coherent piece of a stretch of information. So this graph here shows how one translator produces the translation for this particular word. Then I told you, okay, so before this, we also have here, we just chunk the typing activities, right? So these are chunks of typing. We can do the same with the reading activities. So we can see that we have source text reading, target text reading, source text target text reading, and so on. And we have different durations of these chunking of these reading activities, and then sometimes they overlap with typing activities, and sometimes they are alternating, right? So this blue box here, this reading here, is before this typing takes place, and so on. So this is for one translator. Here is so here is just the overlay, so the coordination between the typing and the reading activities, right? It's all the same translation, but just chunked in a different way. With overlaid reading on the source and the target text and the translation produced. Here is the same translation, only the awareness of other hospital stuff and so on. So this the same source text, but produced by a different translator. And you can see that this translator has a quite different patterns. So whereas the one before quite immediately started translating, and then when this problem occurred, there was a kind of a rereading and stopping and so on. This person here reads so many times these sentences. You can see that the person reads this sentence, then goes over the whole sentence again, then here again towards the end, and then again. So 3, 4, 5 times this person first reads this one sentence before starting typing in the translation. So this, this kind of orientation phase that precedes this production here takes already 10, how much is it? 10 seconds or so. 12 seconds maybe, but then this typing is quite fluent, and you see also this inversion here of the other hospital stuff and so on, and this quite linear word-for-word translation in this later part. So whereas some parts of the translation are similar between these different translators, other parts are quite different. All right, so we try to see. So this would be a difference in the translation process, right? So the translators produce different kinds of behavioral patterns with respect to source text reading, with respect to pausing structure during the typing of the translation. And here we can chunk this translation up in the same in a similar way. We have a long reading here first, reading phase before the translation starts, and then we have a quite fluent typing with overlapping monitoring and gazing activities and so on. So this is a kind of a variation, and we for the translation behavior. We can also look at the translation product, so what comes out from a translation. And here this is an example from a Spanish translation. We have 22 different translations, 22 translations of this text into Spanish. Okay, and the different translators produce different translations. It's unlikely that any two translations are exactly identical, right? But some words are, or translators often agree to, or in some words, they agree all here to translate four into the same word, cuatro, which is Spanish for four, right? So they all 22 translators translate this for in the same way, whereas other words like given here, all translators there are different solutions for a word. So we have stretches of text that are unambiguous. All translators produce the same solution. Other stretches in the same segment, sentence that where translators produce different translations. And we can quantify this. We can count probabilities. We can see the distribution of these different translations. And here is the sentence that I showed before. He was given four. Okay, he was given four. These four words in the beginning of the sentences. Here we have all the solutions of the 22 translators decomposed, and we can see that here, for instance, this word given, we see that there were all these different solutions produced. Four translators produced this word as a translation. Four translators produced this one here, and then we have a large number of unique solutions for this translation. So we have a large number of different solutions, a quite flat distribution, if you like, whereas for cuatro, all 22 translators produced the same. From this distribution, we can compute, of course, probabilities, information values, and entropy values, and which would be given here as H star. And these entropy values would indicate the ambiguity or the flatness or the peakness of this distribution. So if the entropy is 0, means that there is no information, that all translators produce the same translation. If the entropy value is very high, many translators produced many different translations. The distribution is more flat. And here we have words that are somehow in between. Okay, so it turns out that these are quite interesting measures to measure the variation in the translation process, and then we can look into the correlations between these different measures and so on, which I will do in a moment from our database when we look into this. So we have collected about more than 5,000 translation sessions, all with keystroke logging, many with gaze data. We have translations into many different languages. Some translations are, we have 100 versions of one translation. For a Chinese, for this text here translated into Chinese, we have 100 versions with key logging and gaze data. So we can assess these entropy values quite precisely. These data can be added with machine translation output, with part-of-speech tags, with phrases information, and so on, with lots of additional linguistic information. Then I just want to finally show this slide here, whereas until now we have mostly used this translog program to for data acquisition, the tool that I showed with the source and the target window. This here is a professional tool that most, if not all, translators know very well. Most translators will have worked with this Trados. I understand that I don't speak to translators here, so you might not be familiar with this tool. But yeah, so we have here on the source, on the left side is usually the source side, and on the right side we have the target side. And this can be from scratch translation. It means the segment is empty, the translator types in the translation, or it can be pre-filled by a machine translation system, and the translator just corrects the right side by looking on the left and the right, what needs to be changed and so on. So this is a translation, a computer-assisted translation tool with lots of assistance around it. Means that you have different kinds of resources that can be used that are tailored for translators, such as bilingual dictionary, collocation tools, and so on. But the interesting thing here is that this tool also has a key logging device, which is called Qualitivity. And so whatever a translator modifies or types in on the right side here in this box will be logged, and we have now produced a conversion tool that allows us to upload this data, to analyze this data as we do with the Trados tool. Okay, so lastly, I will just point to a publication that just appeared in July this year, Explorations in Empirical Translation Process Research, where much of this work is that we have done in the past couple of years is documented. Okay, are there any questions with respect to this? Then otherwise, I would take now time to show this interface that we have with the server. But if there are questions right now with respect to this part, I'm happy to already answer this. No question? Okay, then let me see. I would like to okay, let me open this browser web page here. Okay. So can you? Oh, you okay? I need to also I need to switch the screen sharing screen here. So I go to another screen here. I share the entire screen, okay? Now, does that make sense? Okay. I share then only a window. Is that better? Okay. Can you see that? Not now?
Yes, that is where we can see.
Okay, so this is an interface, a web interface that shows these translation progression graphs that I have presented previously in an online version. And we have one, here are the number of studies. I said we have 5,000 sessions. We have all these are studies, different studies. And a study has several sessions. A session would be would have something like maybe 20 minutes or so, and we can choose on this interface a study and a session. By the way, they are documented on the CRIT web page, what these sessions and studies are. And now this is Hindi, so I load this session here, and unfortunately it does not show Hindi characters. So this is R shiny. If anybody knows, I've spent some time trying to show here the Hindi characters on the right side, and it doesn't manage. So if somebody knows how to show Hindi characters in R shiny, I would be very happy. But anyway, trust me, this is Hindi, okay? So what we can see here is a translation progression graph. So here is on the left side is the source text, and just like before, and on the horizontal axis is the translation time. Now we can zoom into this area here. For instance, if we go into this, can you see this on the screen? How I move the? Yes, you can see my mouse now. So if I zoom into this area here, which is around 900,000 duration in milliseconds, I can go here, right? Something like this, and maybe look into this segment until something like this. Then you can see here, and I can also, of course, make more precise the source words. Okay, something like this. And you can see that here the person reads the segment first. Okay, China has, okay, so it doesn't show all the words here. If you wanted to see all the words, we could also maybe zoom more into this. Okay, but anyway, you can see that the person here reads the segment first, okay, quite precisely, only the exact segment. This is the segment boundary, right? And then reads it again, and then types in stuff. This again is Hindi keystrokes, which is not visualized correctly. But the timestamp at least should be correct. So you see some typing takes place, then in red there are deletions here, then in green you see monitoring. So this is gaze data on the targets window while the characters emerge. Then you see then rereading here the source text, then retyping and so on. So this person has quite some problems translating these sentences here with several times rereading this whole segment. So we can zoom into these different sessions and look into this, and then we can, of course, also, or not of course, but we can also visualize these production units here. They are shown up here. Maybe it makes sense to zoom a little bit into this in more detail. And you can see that here some production took place, and here, and so on. So we can see the productions, and then we can see the fixations. Oops, what happened here? So these are the productions. Okay. Well, I'm sorry for this. It doesn't show the fixation units for some reasons. But you can imagine that we would see here along fixation units in blue, right, reading the source text, and then we would have here green and red merging up. So this is one tool to visualize the process. Now I want to show still. I still, there's some time still that I can use, right? Yes. I want to show our interface to the database, and we have all these 5,000 sessions here are on a server, and we can also access the server through a Jupyter Notebook. Would people be knowledgeable about Jupyter and Python in this audience? No? Yes? But they are mostly programmers, right? So you would know about programming. Is it? Well, no answer. Then I just assume, I just hope that this is the case. Yes or no? I was told, well, you are mostly, okay, so anyway, we can load with these functions here. Yes, okay, so good. So we can load from this study that I showed here, NJ12, a couple of tables. So the database has a number of tables, and these tables are summary tables of pre-compiled summary tables showing different aspects of this data. So this SS, so this would read the sessions into a big table. And this is the session table. Here we can see each line represents one session, and the session would be one whole, this would be one session, right? So the entire translation for this particular participant text would be one session. And you can see here that we have so many different sessions, and we can load data related to sessions into these tables here. So what does this table show? Here it gives some kind of general data. So we have the study name, NJ12, then we have the participant, and then we have the tasks. So we have post-editing and translation. Then it says how many segments there are. And these segments are shown on this slide here as in these horizontal bars. So a segment would basically mean a sentence. So this text has 5 source sentences, right? So this is text number 3, and this text number 3 would be shown here. It has 5 segments on the source and the target side, and it shows here different types of duration. So this first participant translates this time and uses, how much is this? 1,338 seconds, which is 20 minutes or so, maybe. Then we have, as I said, as I showed in the one of the earlier slides, we can distinguish a drafting phase and a revision phase. And this column here says after 24 seconds, the person starts drafting. Okay, so means the 25 first seconds were orientation, and the revision phase starts after 1,168 seconds. So this is after 20 minutes, and then the remaining time is then spent in the revision phase. And you can see that here, so we have text number 3 here, or So all these texts take different amount of time. Then we have a different durations here. These are the durations when taking out pauses of more than 5 seconds, I believe. Then we have the number of the duration if we only take those chunks that are production typing burst of 5 seconds. Here we have the number of fixations on the source text, fixations on the source text, fixations on the target text, the number of fixations, the number of insertions, the number of deletions, and so on. So we have quite some data that we can now try to analyze and to relate to each other. So here we have 100 sessions, and these are 35 features per session. We have, these are the translators. We have 21 participants, means we have 21 participants producing 100 sessions, means that each participant produces approximately 5 texts. And now we can produce some graphs here. Here we can put into relation the pauses and the typing time. So remember that we have, as I showed in this graph, right, we have typing bursts and pauses between the typing bursts. If I zoom, if I make this a little bit, if I go into any arbitrary place here, we see that there are typing bursts, something is typed, and there is a pause, right? So we call this a pause. I mean, the person reads stuff, okay, but it is a typing pause. And if we look only into these typing bursts, the total typing time and the pauses longer than 5 seconds, then we can see that the time increases if the number of pauses also increases, right, with a quite high correlation here. We can also look into the typing time. And by task. So we have post-editing, means the translator had some texts, and so a machine translation that was post-edited, or T is translation from scratch. There was no time given, no text given. The translator produced from scratch. And we see here the relation between the pause time and the typing time. It looks quite similar here, only that the whole, all the dots seems to be shifted to a little bit up for the post-editing sessions. Here we see typing time per text and task. So we see here that on average post-editing is quicker than translating from scratch. We can see here that the pause time is more in translation than in post-editing. Pauses of more than 1 second. Okay, so maybe you may wonder why we would look into this, these things. And one of the, so if we look back into these graphs here, one of the interesting parameters in translation process research is the relation between pausing and typing. Of course, the typing, these typing bursts here, is the productive time, right? So when the translator produces some output, and the pausing time is a time that reflects kinds of preparation for the successive typing bursts, we can assume. And so the longer these pauses are, the more cognitive effort is spent That's the assumption, right? We assume that more pauses, or longer pauses, would reflect more reading effort, more thinking effort, here rereading, and so on. Than if there was, for instance, here there are typing bursts which are quite fast following each other. So that stretch of text seems to be less difficult than, for instance, this phrase here to translate. And we can see here in this graph that in post-editing, this relation is much higher in translation than in post-editing, which is an indicator that post-editing is maybe less effortful than translation. Here we have the same thing with reading time, source text reading time. So how much of the fixations were found on the source text in post-editing and in translation. Again, source text reading is much less in post-editing than in translation. Here is the gaze time on the target side. And we see that here the difference is not as big, right? So in the source text, compare this to the target text, the difference is not as big. Then we can look into typing time per text.
Michael? Yes, as actually they are looking for to start the next session. So can you wind up in 5 minutes? I think these things people can log into Jupyter Notebook and run these things, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, no, you need to have an account. But yeah, so if there's any question, please go ahead and ask a question. And if you're interested in this kind of running this Jupyter Notebook, yes, you're very welcome to get an account on the server and get access to this Jupyter and run these kinds of scripts yourself. Yes. So I have lots of more stuff here to show, but of course that is maybe to a certain extent self-explanatory, and you're very welcome to do this if there's some interest. Okay.
Yes, somebody has some question.
Yes. There are some questions?
Hello.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, yes, sir. Actually, there will be some delay time between reading passage of a sample text. So we are that delay time of that particular word of that sample text. We have to call the function in text to speech in terms of speech synthesis.
Okay, so here we are talking about translation typing. We're not talking about spoken. It's not a speech recognition. It's so translators conventionally and typically type in translations. They sit in front of the keyboard and type. Okay, so this is typing activity. And if you're so I'm not sure what you mean where we have speech. So when I was talking in the beginning about think aloud, this was a technique that was used like 20 years ago to record what a translator says. But here we can look directly into what a translator does. Does this answer your question to some extent? Yeah.
No, sir. Actually, the delay time, it call the function into in terms of speech synthesizer. Like we have to call the TTS function, the delay time of the word while reading the sample text, the eye movement data. That's delay time. Have to call the function of TTS in terms of speech synthesis.
What is TTS? Text to speech. Or what is TTS function?
Text to speech. function in for using gaze tracking?
Well, gaze. So a gaze is what the eyes do. So if you read a text and the
Yes, sir.
eyes
Yes, sir.
and speech is not involved there. Where I mean, I'm not talking about speech. So it
Actually,
has only.
sir, read aloud technology means there. I have reviewed one paper which is called Gray, which is combination of text to speech in terms of speech synthesis, and as well as using gaze tracking, the XYZ position of gaze.
Yeah, so I mean, people work on all kinds of things, but this, I mean, we have also looked into spoken translation, right? So a translator can speak out a translation, or they can use the keyboard to type in the translation. But usually they do either or maybe, yeah. So but if they speak out the translation, so they would read the source text, right, and speak out a translation, and the spoken translation would then need to be transcribed, and then we would have not text to speech, but speech to text, right? So it's an automatic speech recognition system. We have also worked with this, and we can then correlate the gaze data on the source text and the spoken translation. But I was not talking about this right now. So this is of course similar research, but adds an additional layer of difficulty. Does that answer? Is that an answer that you are?
Yeah, so technology maybe mismatch. So actually, he's trying to ask maybe that your technology, whatever during the typing the keyboard, what is you're interpreting. So is it possible that text to speech from the screen using gaze tracking, some technologies available, or can we apply your methodology in this technology or not? See, actually, he's trying to asking this question maybe.
Text to, but what should text to speech do? Why would you use? So I'm talking about translation.
Yeah. Little bit he is asking different track, which is not in the scope of this lecture. No issue, sir. Okay.
Yeah, no, but I mean also, so we text to speech would mean you have a text, okay, maybe a Hindi text, and that Hindi text would be
actually when any candidate will read the text, if the difficulty is found, the system will tell the what is the actual difficulty is there to identify the reading disability of any autistic or dyslexic child.
Yeah, okay, so that, but a translator should not be dyslexic.
The
job of a translator is, I mean, the translators need to be quite good readers. Usually they are not dyslexic.
Yeah.
I guess that's incompatible with this job.
Okay, sir. No issue.
Well, it could be, no? I mean, so you have interpreters. So usually in the translation environment, people make a distinction between translators and interpreters. And translators would only be involved in textual products. So they would read a text and type out a translation. They would not usually speak the translation. And then you have interpreters who would hear a text, listen. So for instance, a conference interpreter, okay, would listen to what the speaker says and speak out the translation in another language, right, in the target language. So they would have the two language. I mean, a translator would also, writing this, would have to be activate the two languages at the same time. But an interpreter would have to do this in an auditory model. So they would hear the source text and speak out the translation. And the translator would read the translation using the eyes and using the hand, the fingers, to type out the translation. So these are two different kinds of skills and two different kinds of problems. They are related because they both are different languages are involved, but the problems are quite different for these two modes of translation.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Actually, we have to go for the next session now.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So it's a very nice talk. Whatever you delivered to the early morning. So maybe in late night in your side. So really thankful on behalf of organizer team. We are thanking you for this session.
I wanted to give a kind of an impression what translation process is about and what kind of methods we are using, and so on. So it's just a rough overview. Many more details can be explained, but I think that should be done later, maybe on another session. Yeah.
Sure, sir. Next time we'll see.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And if somebody comes up, wants an access to this this database and play around with this, very welcome. Very welcome. Let me know.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, and have a good fun for the rest of your workshop.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.